Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dimitri Zabelin, a geopolitical strategist and founder of Pantheon Insights, a long resume that includes the World Economic Forum and their focus on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, amongst many other notable research and positions held by Dimitri, joining us all the way from California. So thank you, Dimitri.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I suppose we'll start, Dimitri, in the obvious place, which is the recent results of the US presidential election, which sees Donald Trump returning to the White House. And we've had a few weeks now to kind of digest that idea and to see, of course, his selection and for the leadership positions in his cabinet, as well as some of the policies that he articulated on the campaign trail and how they synergize with the choices that he's made for his cabinet ministers. So perhaps we'll start there. And what do you think? I mean, there's a lot on the list in the Trump sort of bucket, if you like, but from a point of view of sort of first half of next year coming out of the gate and maybe already starting to influence, but what do you think is sort of top of the agenda on the to-do list regarding the new president?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the two biggest platforms that made his campaign so successful were immigration and tariffs. And those seem to be the two big policy issues that Americans and policymakers alike are both looking forward to, and I would argue equally concerned. The general consensus, not officially but unofficially, seems to suggest Trump's policies will be inflationary by nature, and that's excluding tax cuts, and that's not even including mass deportations. And there's a lot of there's a lot of legislative and legal potential obstacles to those. So I'll start off with the deportations part because that's the shortest part, but also I think the one that's going to be have the most ambiguity to it. So there's a theory that Mr. Trump may declare a national emergency at the border, and that will then allow him to use a legal avenue of being able to use the Pentagon's resources to address the immigration crisis that he alluded to on his campaign. The problem with that, though, from an inflationary angle, is that if you look at the workforce in the United States, I believe it's 50% of all agriculture workers, 15 to 20% of construction workers, and then I think 8 to 10% of service workers in the restaurant industry and similar sectors are all composed of illegal immigrants. So if you remove that labor force, what's going to happen is you will have an upside inflationary risk. Because if they were to be replaced by Americans, which is not likely in my view, but even if they were to, they would demand much higher wages. Those would then be reflected in consumer goods. So naturally, that's hyperinflationary. But again, that's predicated on the speed and magnitude of these initiatives of these mass deportations that he's looking to carry out. So that's a big variable. As for tariffs,
so you think that would be top of the agenda, that the whole tackle the immigration issue from day one? That's like where on the to-do list is such that you think that would be ranking quite high early in this new year?
I would, but just because it's his priority, it doesn't necessarily mean he'll be able to push it through, because you'll remember during his first term, he had both houses of Congress, at least for the first 2 years. And even then, we saw a lot of internal fighting that prevented major reform and a lot of the policy initiatives that he wanted to push through. Tariffs were an exception because that was through an emergency declaration, essentially. Specifically, I think it's Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which is on the basis of national security, you're able to impose these tariffs. But I can get into that in a second. I think top of the agenda will be immigration. We saw during the campaign that that's something that deeply resonated with voters by, and there was the whole commentary about, the borders are a disaster and everything else. So I think a lot of that, essentially his sweeping victory too, essentially gave him a mandate to follow through on all these policies, because he not only won every swing state, he also won the popular vote. So that essentially can help embolden him, and the American people de facto put a rubber stamp on his policies.
Is there any
and said,
gap?
yes, this is
Is
what
there
we
any
want.
gap?
Again,
Is there any? Sorry to just counter that because I think
sure.
inevitably everybody has a plan till they're punched in the nose and things are challenged. And of course, the momentum of the victory for Trump was in the aftermath of recent weeks, seemingly convincing. But as we go through, more time passes, we digest the realities. He won by a very slim majority in terms of the popular vote. I think maybe by a million, 74 to million to 73, something like that. The Republicans have a wafer thin majority in the House. So yes, there's sweeping sense of victory, and one can claim that. But then in reality, there are these sort of wafer thin divisions. Do the wafer thin divisions raise their ugly head to be a thorn in the side of the momentum of Trump as he goes into office?
Potentially within certain factions within the Republican Party, I would say so. But ultimately, at the end of the day, legally, we see that both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, and the executive branch, obviously separately, are all controlled by Republicans. So even if there were thin margins there, at the end of the day, the Congress and the executive branch is red with a favorable Supreme Court. To that extent, you would think intuitively that he would be able to pass through a lot of these reforms. And that helps explain why markets have been climbing higher, especially on the back of deregulation and a lot of the tax cuts, both of which are theoretically inflationary to a degree, more so the tax cuts
Which is why
than
we've also seen the
deregulation.
dollar strengthening, right? Because the inflation rates aren't going to be coming down, dollar is going to stay strong.
Well, right. So this is where my own theory. This is where I have my own counter theory to that, and we can look at his first term to establish precedent. So again, removing the deportations aspect of it, because I think that's the biggest risk to upside inflation. You'll notice that in his first term, he imposed a lot of tariffs. Obviously, primarily was against China, but then we saw it go against the EU, and I can talk a little bit more about that in terms of what that looks like in a part two. But then we also saw the emergence of intra emerging market trade wars involving Brazil, India, Malaysia, Iran at one point. And again, these may seem like these may seem like smaller economies in comparison, but the aggregate effect of slower trade did see inflation fall, particularly in the US, because we did see it rise initially. Prices did rise. And the theory that Trump has with tariffs is that if you if you tax imported goods, it'll make domestic goods much cheaper. The problem with that, in comparison, the problem with that model is that it assumes that every country has similar labor costs, and they don't, which means imported goods, even when they're tariffed, are still less expensive than domestic goods. So then all you get all around are just higher prices from imported goods and domestic retailers looking to capture those higher prices. That was inflationary, and there's no doubt about that, and there's data to support that. What became deflationary were the ripple effects of the trade war, the retaliatory tariffs that saw trade shrink from 4.7, 5.7% growth in 2017, I believe it was, to 0.4% in 2019. We also saw then the Fed respond to that by lowering interest rates in response to the trade war. That is something that's deflationary. So I think to that extent, we could see tariffs actually curb some of the inflationary aspects of it to the extent that it dampens growth. And we saw that in his first term. So there is precedent for it. Yeah.
If we look at all the things you've just mentioned, inevitably they generate a lot of friction. I mean, it's one thing to have a policy, a state of emergency around illegal migrants. You've got to then go out and catch them and put them in a van and lock them up and put them on a bus and TV cameras. And, there's a lot of friction in that. There's a lot of uncertainty in economic outlook. And of course, on the bigger global sense, the tariffs and the reaction to the tariffs, there's going to be friction in trade and retaliation. What does all of that do to growth and to outlook and investment and confidence and so forth? The stock market seems to like it so far, but I'm just wondering, as it all sort of comes to reality, that level of friction, which seems, potentially enormous, never mind costly, but just friction and the unknown, what that does to a somewhat fragile global economy, U.S. economy.
Well, certainly we saw bond markets respond in anticipation of higher prospective interest rates as a function of the inflationary aspects of his policies. That's reflected in the market. But I think particularly investors are excited about the prospect of deregulation, and they're looking forward to tax cuts, both of which would be a huge boost to productivity, but also generally would just create a much more favorable environment for risk taking. Where that could be curbed, again, is the response of the Fed to some of these macroeconomic changes resulting from his policies. To the extent that that may then offset the risk-oriented nature that these investors have and the jubilance from the tax cuts and deregulation, that part is still unclear.
If we look specifically at China, of course, which seems to be the target of the biggest tariffs as announced so far. I mean, all of this is still in the sort of election mantra noise and starting to maybe we don't have a clearer identification yet on who the financial secretary, the secretary of the treasury, as they call it, and there's a treasury secretary in the US, and then the commerce secretary and other key positions yet to be filled in the cabinet or at least announced. But China seems to be the target and the overarching common denominator of all of these appointments, fairly hawkish Chinese officials that have said many things and so forth. Where do you think that plays out, this face-off between China and America? Are we already in a quote-unquote new Cold War? How do you define it? How do you see it playing out? Biden was pretty hawkish himself, but maybe not as confrontational, but hawkish. Your thoughts as we go into a second Trump presidency, where the U.S.-China relationship goes and China's reaction to all of this?
That's a great question. Well, I think the tension between the US and China really began to bubble up and escalate during Trump's first presidency with direct economic confrontation through tariffs. Pardon me, but then when Mr. Biden took over in 2020, we saw that he actually didn't remove those tariffs. What he instead did was impose targeted export controls, specifically around very sensitive technology as it relates to AI interfacing chips that have both civilian and military applications. To that extent, it created sort of I think the phrase is like a walled garden in that sense, where they wanted to target very specific, not commodities, very specific technologies without disrupting the broader market. Versus Mr. Trump in his first term, we saw it was just tariffs everywhere. I think his idea is at a minimum, he wants to put 10 to 20% tariffs on all goods imported to the US. But I think with China, he wants to bring it up to 60%, which is quite a bit. But let's not forget that Mr. Biden, I think it was a year ago from today, imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and solar, both of which are a form of industrial policy that fundamentally is the same thing that Mr. Trump has proposed and campaigned on, which is America first. It's the same in all but name. And it's not good or bad. It's just a secular theme that's going on between presidents. To that extent, relations between the US and China will become certainly much more tense. We are seeing China conduct way more military drills in the Taiwan Strait. We are seeing more, I would argue, bellicose rhetoric out of China, specifically Xi Jinping towards Taiwan. And I could see those economic relations begin to be something that can drive the wedge between them even further. To that extent, I don't really see any detente between the US and China so much as maybe convenient moments of strategic detente, but nothing that would indicate a secular kind of peace.
I'm thinking, in a way, a lot about South America. I mean, in the last few days, we saw the Chinese leader in Peru opening a major new Chinese operated owned port there, which is a gateway into Latin America. Right on America's doorstep, slowly but surely, not so slowly over the last decade, China has made major inroads there. Now with a Latino in the Secretary of State position, Marco Rubio, how do you see all of that playing out on America's doorstep, this China-US détente, Cold War, trade friction, as China progressively makes deep inroads into Latin America?
Right. So it's funny you say that because the G20 summit is ongoing in Brazil right now, and Lula and Xi Jinping are getting along quite well. There's a lot of investments being made in the energy transition, specifically with establishing factories there to manufacture EVs. China is the largest exporter and producer of them. But this is why Trump is also looking to tariff countries like Mexico, who are part of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Because what China does, and this is something that they've been doing to circumvent sanctions, is they've been setting shops in foreign countries and then using them as basis to ship Chinese-made goods in those countries into the U.S. A great example of this is Vietnam. We've seen that Vietnamese exports to the U.S. have increased, but domestically there hasn't been a sufficient macroeconomic change to account for those extra exports until you look at the accounting and you see that Chinese imports into Vietnam have risen at a commensurate rate to the amount of Vietnamese exports going to the U.S. Same thing is also happening in Mexico, where a lot of Chinese companies are setting up EVs, which is why Trump is looking to
but isn't that a nature of this?
Looking to tariff those.
When we think about all of these sort of workarounds, where the U.S. has been sanctioning everybody about everything for decades now, and consequently, there is endless sort of reroutings. We're seeing that very predominantly also in the oil environment, the ship-to-ship transfers with radars turned off and flows going everywhere they want and need to go. That unless one comes down with this sort of draconian sort of similar thing like you're talking about, arresting the busboy in the local chipper or pizza place on your street, the level of granular lockdown and implementation that would be needed to close down all these reroutings to ensure these sort of sanctions or tariffs are met. Do you think U.S. has that scale of velocity, of resource, of intention to make all of this a success or make it real?
I think more so it's a game of whack-a-mole, because essentially all that's happening is supply chains are getting longer, but fundamentally, all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to Beijing. A lot of these supply chains are just being, like I said earlier, routed through these different countries. Well, I always talked about sanctions and the U.S. using the U.S. dollar as, it's kind of like taking Excalibur, hitting it against a rock until all you're left with is a butter knife. There's only so many times you can threaten sanctions that you then undermine your own geofinancial leverage. Because part of the way the U.S. is able to exert so much pressure and influence global affairs without the use of military is through the U.S. dollar, because we have a dollar-centric system. The U.S. deliberately, or not, maybe not deliberately, but the U.S. running a trade deficit means that we import goods, but that also means we export dollars, which means all these countries and companies abroad are locked into a dollar-centric system that is more costly to leave than it is to stay in. And that helps countries fall in line with Washington's foreign policy. To that extent, they can leverage that conduit, but there's no way, I don't think, that any country, for that matter, even as powerful as the U.S., would be able to squash any attempt to circumvent sanctions.
Because the other part of, one of this sort of variety of things that have emerged in the shadow of this kind of extraterritorial sanctions and trade imposition and sort of weaponizing the dollar and all of these things is the emergence of the BRICS. It was emerging, it might have emerged anyway or whatever, but it's certainly giving the BRICS, the collection of countries that are now growing in their number, including our neighborhood countries here, Saudi Arabia and UAE, increasingly more relevance, certainly not without its challenges. India and China together in a room has got multiple challenges, but nonetheless, it is emerging as a new entity, as an alternative framework away from the G7 and so forth. As we look through the prism of all these things we've talked about, how do you see the emergence of the BRICS, the emerging economies, and their influence in geopolitics?
Sure. So BRICS was actually created. It was a term coined by a Goldman Sachs analyst to list originally BRIC. The S for South Africa was added later. He just used it as an acronym to talk about a couple of emerging market economies with a lot of investment potential. It only later became a somewhat formalized group. My take on this is it's not really BRICS so much as it is a China plus group. If you look at the countries in there and you look at the amount of funding that the institutions get, it's primarily all China. They're essentially trying to mimic the post-World War II system that the US did with the creation of the World Bank and the IMF. It has its mirror institutions, essentially, that it's using to complement BRICS. Furthermore, all the countries within BRICS trade more externally than they do with each other. So that in and of itself is telling. China has also had border disputes with Russia and India. You alluded to that earlier, how tense it was. When we had the regional Cooperation Economic Partnership Agreement put forth, which is going to be, I think it is now the largest trade agreement ever, it excludes India. And India deliberately stepped out of that to avoid having cheap Chinese goods flood their markets and displace local producers. All this to say is that there's a lot of intra-group competition between players like Russia, China, and India that prevents them from creating a cohesive bloc. That's just one of the points. The other one, China's financial system domestically isn't sufficiently stable enough to be able to become a reserve currency. To the extent that they agree with de-dollarization, and that's something Lula and Xi Jinping agree with, that seems to be a common thread. The idea of living in a multipolar world and de-dollarization tags onto that. But to the extent that they form a cohesive group that has any sort of geoeconomic rivalry with G7 or G20, I don't see much of that. You alluded to the new members. The UAE recently joined. As I understand it, Saudi Arabia has expressed interest, but they're not quite ready yet to commit to it. And the marginal benefits, in my view, to that don't seem to be that high. I suppose
ultimately these, what it is now and what it can be and what it may become, it's a bit like Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin? Ultimately, it's this weird thing that has emerged because the US has $33 trillion of debt and they running a 6% deficit every year for the next decade. So something alternative has to emerge with some sense of value relevance. And it seems like everybody is obsessed that Bitcoin might be that thing. The BRICS seems to be a similar thing. It's like, well, what is it? I don't really know. It's a bunch of pretty big countries and it's growing in its number and they meet every year and they seem to be starting to think about an alternative universe than the G7. I mean, at the end of the day, the US is also talking about sanctioning their European partners and maybe defunding NATO. It doesn't exactly look like the G7 is a harmonious place. When you look at these pieces and they're emerging alternatives, and we have a kind of a Trump 2.0 with full of friction to their friends, never mind their enemies. I mean, is the BRICS there to emerge? Do you think that it could continue to evolve and have some sense of cohesion and relevance?
To that extent, no, because I think China, Russia, and India are not happy with being in second place. And, with me, I always say, with the headlines and the narrative, it's certainly very compelling to make it seem like, that the United States is falling or it's falling apart. But at the end of the day, you have to go back to the numbers. Dollar usage in international transactions keeps breaking records. That in itself is a vote of faith and confidence in the US dollar. Again, China's own domestic tribulations will prevent it from being, and they've even scaled back actually as a result of their domestic unrest and the demographic change that's weighing on productivity, higher labor costs, property market values fluctuating, extreme volatility that's requiring state intervention, as is frequently done in China. They simply don't have, in my view, the macroeconomic stability to be able to lead a group like this, which is why if you look at their Belt and Road Initiative, they've had to scale back to quote unquote smaller, more beautiful projects, which is a big downgrade from their big vision earlier. It's not to say that BRICS doesn't have any insightful value analytically. It certainly is created in response to something and to a certain sentiment, but to the degree that it poses a credible economic threat to the West, I don't see that, and investors and markets don't seem to see that either, and even the countries within BRICS don't seem to believe that either, because their external trade with the West is higher than it is within the group. That in itself, I think, is an indication.
Let's close out, and we could talk about so many other things, but I do want to make sure we get into the OPEC, non-OPEC oil supply bucket. I mean, inevitably, that's kind of our main wheelhouse. We're coming to the end of the year, 2024, where demand is soft, supply is abundant. We have an IEA forecast for 2025 of a 1 million barrel a day surplus under current market supply demand outlook. What's your thoughts on the sort of OPEC and non-OPEC oil supply war market share battle we saw flagged in the Financial Times a few months ago? What do you think we're lining up for in 2025?
So I have a bearish outlook on oil in 2025. A couple of reasons why. One, I do believe that if Trump follows through on his tariffs, and I believe he will, like we saw during his first term, even though Saudi and OPEC kept cutting production, prices kept falling because the demand was simply just not there. And that was a function of the trade wars and retaliatory tariffs and the ripple effect that it had and the impact it had on growth. I believe we're going to see that again this year. I think the IEA recently put out a report saying they revised down their outlook for 2025 from 1.64 million barrels per day down to 1.54. And that even if OPEC were to keep its current production cuts, which it did extend until the end of December of 2025, even then there will still be an oversupply. To that extent, I could see weak growth and oversupply combined with the Trump administration that's much more favorable to deregulation and pumping out more oil out of the U.S., really dragging down oil prices. That in itself is an inflationary force. Yeah.
Do you think the U.S. majors now in the control of the shale basins react to those Trump gifts, if you like? Because of course they don't want oil prices to collapse either.
Right. I think for the smaller operators, they obviously operate at a much higher price for break-even rate, which is why I think it was in March of it was May of 2020 or April when we had the OPEC meeting in Vienna and Russia and Saudi Arabia walked away and said, we're just going to continue pumping oil, that we saw oil prices just completely plunge, and that priced out. Some people thought it was like a deliberate geopolitical move to price out much higher cost producers in the US. To that extent, I don't think we'd see that same strategy happen here again.
Just to finally close out on, because this is the news of the day, expectations from U.S. actions in the war in Europe. We're seeing overnight the approval by the Biden administration to allow the Ukrainians to utilize their weapons, the long-range missiles, which gives them the ability to send rockets deep into Russia. It was always regarded as a significant game changer. The Russians always warned against it. Your thoughts on the outlook as to the current, like in the immediate aftermath of that new decision, new action, and then as we follow through to Trump into the new year?
Well, yeah, so a lot of not fanfare, but a lot of the headlines going on are about Putin lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. If Putin's intelligent, I don't think he would use it because he understands that the incoming Trump administration is more likely than not going to draft up a peace deal that will include land concessions that Russia was looking to secure in the first place. They would jeopardize that by shooting a nuke into Ukraine. So as a prudent, so even like morality aside, just as a strategic move, I don't think Putin would do that. It's also at the same time that Ukraine's morale and troop recruitment is suffering and they continue to suffer territorial losses. So to the extent that it's increased escalation, Russia, of course, responded in that way. But I would be very surprised if Russia looked to escalate at a time when they're looking to secure a peace deal, an easy way out. Because if they push too hard, it would force Trump to consider renegotiation. And that would damage one of his campaign promises. So I think there's a mutual strategic interest for Putin not to use a nuclear weapon.
Well, that's not quite the word I was expecting to wrap up on, but it will be it. And nonetheless, it's always there as a backdrop. I mean, escalation of a war in Europe that brings in the NATO facing off face to face with Russia, then nuclear is clearly and has been lingering as a sort of threat in the backdrop. We'll have to see what the new year brings when Trump's team takes over the policy management there. But until then, Dimitri Zabelin, geopolitical strategist, founder of Pantheon Insights, thank you so much. Really interesting. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on.